for circularity to really work, we have to see our materials in a loop. And one way to think of it is that we're just borrowing them from that loop. We're borrowing them from the planet, that we don't own them. They're not going to be there for that long. And we have to design understanding that.
You're listening to Piper, the podcast where we decode healthy and regenerative design. I'm Beth Cochran. In talking about the embodied carbon and waste burden of the built environment, much of the focus has traditionally been on the structure and the enclosure, or the core and shell of the building. But in more recent years, some of the attention has shifted to the interior, and early studies show that interiors can actually surpass the embodied carbon impact and waste burden of the initial building over its average 60-year life. This is because of the rate of interior renovation, which in commercial environments is now occurring every 5 to 10 years, roughly. And because materials used in interiors tend to be more complex, they're often mixed, bonded, or composites, they're typically harder to recycle. Rather than given a second life, things like carpet, wall systems, FF&E, ceiling tiles, and mechanical and electrical equipment are relegated to the landfill. Enter David Bergman. A self-proclaimed eco-optimist, David has built a career around inspiring those in the design field and beyond to consider a mindset shift, that sustainable design and lifestyle choices don't have to equate to sacrifice. From his ecology club days in high school and college, to authoring a book on sustainable design and helping bring more sustainability courses to the Parsons School of Design in New York, and to his latest venture, the Center for Circularity in Interior Design, sustainability and circularity have simply been a way of life for David. To him, these should be the standards of design rather than considered part of the quote-unquote green movement. And though his interest started in childhood, it wasn't until a fortuitous exhibit of eco-materials in the 90s that challenged him to shift his thinking.
In the 90s, it was sort of a confluence of things, but one I like to point out is that through circles of friends, I went to a small exhibit of sustainable or eco materials at the time and discovered some neat materials, some new, some old, and thought, well, I can use these in my projects. I don't have to do, the granola burlap design. There's some cool materials where I can do cool architecture and interiors with it. And that sort of shifted my thinking. And then I started thinking about ways to use those materials conventionally or unconventionally. And as a sort of a side business, I then got into lighting and had a company for a bunch of years, and it was called Fire and Water at the time, because actually I started out with an uneco material. I was using copper plumbing tube at first. But when I shifted that, I became what I'm pretty sure is the only company that was doing lighting, sustainable lighting, from both an energy efficient and materials conscious point of view. And combining that with the architecture I was moving into. And then I began teaching as well. And that really pushed me further to do more and more research. And at the time I was teaching primarily at Parsons School of Design, and was asked to do a sustainability course for the product design department based on my lighting work. And that expanded into creating sustainability courses in actually several other departments there. I wasn't the first by any means sustainability instructor there, but there wasn't much at the school before that. There were a couple people doing some great work I don't want to belittle, and got more and more involved in doing the sustainable architecture. And then I also began teaching at the New York School of Interior Design, teaching the sustainable materials course there. And that evolved after a few years into being offered the program directorship for the degree there, which is a Master of Professional Studies, and it's got a long title, Master of Professional Studies in Sustainable Interior Environments. It's a postgraduate degree, and it's the only degree that I'm aware of anywhere that is dedicated to sustainable interior design. The way I see that program's purpose is to train the next generation of interior designers practicing or embedding sustainability. Part of it is also this outlook that people view eco-design or sustainability in general as something that we have to do, right? Because it's critical, certainly is, but it's viewed as negative that we have to give up eating beef, we have to give up driving cars, and we do have to do some of that. But the real point that I like to drive at is that those aren't bad things, and there are substitutes for those things, of course. But moreover, my point is that if we really did the things that we need to do environmentally, and we do them in a good fashion, we end up ahead of the game in our lives as well. Things like not being stuck in cars, commuting long distances, for instance, eating healthier diets that are actually good for us and taste good. Emphasizing local community is a big part of sustainability in general. And thinking about the things that we spend our money on consuming. So much of it doesn't really make us happy or yield us, higher quality of life. They're just things that are transient. And if we refocus our values, we can come out as it's so much better individually, socially, species E, whatever that is. And we need to transform this from a thought of necessary sacrifice to something that's desirable.
It kind of reminds me of there was something you said at Build Reuse that I had jotted down. And I think just this plays into the whole mindset
Mhm.
mentality, but that we tend to think of, as designers, tend to think of designs as mini monuments,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
maybe needing to shift that thinking to our designs are more temporary assemblages or borrowed materials. And I thought
Yeah.
that was such a cool concept.
Well, this is what I'm addressing specifically for interior design, not as much, although it can be applicable to architecture. And that's based on the fairly recent acknowledgement of the fact that interiors do not last long. Not because the materials don't last long, largely, although that can happen, but mainly because renovations are so frequent. In the office world, it's often based on lengths of leases, which might be 5 or 10 years. And the average life of an office space, therefore, can be like 7 years. And the average life of a hospitality space is less than that. So the design world has been thinking in terms of whole buildings, meaning the core and the shell and the facade and that sort of stuff. And those do last a long time, but the insides of them go through materials so much faster. Think about if you have a shell that, maybe you replace the glass or something now and then over the span of 50 or 100 years. But over that span, you could have 10 or 20 complete interior renovations of the space. And that's a lot of material, a lot of embodied emissions, because of the energy it takes to make those materials, as well as the natural resources that the materials are made of. So that's a new realization. And what I was getting at when I talked about that, about our mindset, is that it's natural for designers to think, I want to design something to last. And I want it to be really important, well done. But the reality is that in terms of interiors, more often than not, they're very transient because of that turnover, that churn of materials. So that's why one of the what you were quoting, and I thank you for that, is that I want interior designers to start thinking of our spaces as temporary assemblages. That's the first part. Of borrowed materials is the second part, because we haven't yet mentioned the word circularity, but for circularity to really work, we have to see our materials in a loop. And one way to think of it is that we're just borrowing them from that loop. We're borrowing them from the planet, that we don't own them. They're not going to be there for that long. And we have to design understanding that.
How do you define circularity in the context of the interior environment?
Well, first of all, circularity in general, one of the most basic of the principles is no waste, right? Because of the fact that we're on a finite planet. Yeah, they may bring some stuff in from asteroids and things eventually, but essentially everything we have, aside from solar energy, everything we'll ever have is here. But we can't continue extracting materials to use them for a little while and then throw them away into a landfill or incineration. It's just not feasible. It's not, to use that word, sustainable. And that's why we have to think of those materials as in a circular loop where we build them into something, whether it is an interior or a building or uh, clothing, whatever. And it has to, once we have extracted it from the earth, we have to keep it in use. It's just a matter of efficiency and sustainability, because what else can we do? We will run out of some materials at some point, some sooner than others, and our landfills will fill up. An extraordinary percentage of our landfills is construction and demolition waste. It's not sustainable. It's also irresponsible. So yeah, there are other aspects to the definition of circularity, but I think from our point of view, it's no waste is the real one thing.
Jumping back to one thing that
Mhm.
you brought up a little bit earlier about that research has emerged just showing that depending on the rate of interior renovations that
Yeah, yeah.
the embodied carbon impact can quickly surpass the exterior. What do you think needs to change in the practice or process of interior design to
Hmm.
reduce that impact?
Well, I've been talking about this as two things: a mindset and a mechanism. The mechanism is, we can get to that. That's really how the loop itself is made to work, right? How the materials come out of a project and come back into another project. And that involves, lots of people, lots of different parties and processes. But the mindset, which I think is what you were asking about, it involves a few things, but primarily I would say it involves thinking of second life materials and products not as having a stigma, that they should be an inherent part of our materials vocabulary. We should be looking at them at least as often as, interior designers are used to going to showrooms or having reps come to us and sell us the newest thing. And that mechanism part is finding a way for us to access the reuse cycle instead, and integrating it into our libraries and our thinking process, and not regarding that, or sustainability in general, not regarding it as an afterthought, but as, integral to it. I've actually been taken to calling it a before thought instead of an afterthought. And then we have to not think of our projects as our commitment as ending when the client moves in. And there are two parts to that. One is whoever inherits that project with all of its materials and products in it, they need to know what's in there so that they can deconstruct and know what goes where. If there's a manufacturer to refurbish it, where it goes. If it's what alloy of metal or type of plastic something is. We need to have documentation of the materials and products that are handed down to the next owner, the next user. Uh, and by the way, I should have mentioned in the before thought part, if you are renovating a space, you want to be able to know what is there now and what you can keep or reuse within the space. That's the best kind of reuse, is maintaining it or keeping it in some use within that space, not having to go out and find another space to go into. So we should be in the habit of auditing our existing spaces and coming up with a database of what is there and what we can use right there. But jumping back then to having that owner's manual of a sort of what's there would enable that to happen much better. That goes hand in hand with the fact that another part of the interior designer's responsibility has never been worrying about what happens to things afterward. And how are we going to enable that circularity loop? We have to make it easy to take things apart and either reuse them, recycle them. So, and we call that, it's designed for deconstruction, or in the case of products, it's designed for disassembly. And very few people do that right now. And very few people in the interior design world are even aware of the concept. And it's a simple one in its basics. It's, not using adhesives, not using anything that welds materials other than the same material together inseparably, but keeping our materials either mechanically joined together or no joinery at all, as often happens in a lot of Asian woodwork. There's no, it's all wood to wood with not even screws, so that when it comes time for the next project there, things can be taken apart. Right now, demolition, and we have to get rid of the word demolition. We want to call it deconstruction. But demolition is, it's basically people coming in with sledgehammers and breaking it apart and hoping it gets to some waste center that does some recycling. And a major reason for that is almost no choice in some cases. How do you take apart walls to separate out the wallboard from the studs, from the insulation, from even the paint on the walls? It's an incredibly laborious task. And there are some people doing it, but it's difficult and expensive. We need to make it easy. So, and again, we need to make it easy so those materials that are borrowed for that project can have a next life.
It's interesting to think about too when you're designing for future use or for disassembly, you may be selecting healthier materials as well
Well,
by.
yeah. We haven't talked about that. It's the healthy materials is maybe technically not a part of circularity per se, but it certainly is a part of sustainability. And that there's a whole nother aspect of how we look at our materials and making ourselves knowledgeable about the things we should be keeping out of our projects. And there are a lot of resources for that, just not enough designers are employing them or aware of them. There's certain materials we know we don't want PVC in our projects, and unless it's unavoidable as it may be, for instance, in wiring insulation. That's a tough one. And just as we know we don't want lead paint anymore, there's certain materials now on red lists, and there are a few red lists out there that every designer should be aware of, and for their clients' health, not put them in there. It's not just a do-goodism.
When it comes to circularity and doing that audit, if you inherit a place that
Mm.
maybe they didn't make the healthiest
Yeah,
decisions in
yeah.
terms of the materials, how do you evaluate for that? And then, I mean, there's some of the obvious like based paint that's easier to test, but and then
Yeah,
how do you
or
decide?
asbestos.
Yeah, how do you decide what to keep, what's worth keeping, and what is better to replace from a health standpoint?
That's tough right now because first of all, you don't have that handbook I was talking about, and as built of what the materials are. Most designers and architects don't leave that behind. And then we're in a transition period getting us into circularity, and it's going to take a generation of buildings and interiors to fully get to the point where we don't have unhealthy materials in there. But right now, yeah, you have to be smart about it. There are professionals who can deal with the lead and the asbestos. We don't really know how to deal with PFAS right now, and any number of other toxins, and have to find out as much information about the things that are on that site, and then figure out if they can be reused or if they need to go away somewhere, wherever that is.
I was curious how students are responding to the idea of circularity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that younger designers approach reuse differently than maybe some of the more seasoned professionals?
I think it largely yes, because they haven't been indoctrinated in the opposite. It's becoming depending on the program they're in. And my NICID program is students who are there because they want to study sustainability. So they're of course very open to it. That's why they're there. There is, I think, an issue in how it's taught in most regular other architecture and interior design programs. And in fact, we did a bit of a survey because we wanted to try to get a handle on what backgrounds the students who already have professional degrees have as they come into our program, and discovered it was much lighter weight than we had thought. That very few schools had a minor in environmental design or eco design. Some of them didn't even have full courses in it. It may mean that it's been embedded throughout other courses. That would be a positive outcome. I think there's also a little bit of an issue in accreditation where there's so many requirements for programs that it's hard to fit in more emphasis on sustainability. So I think the accreditation programs have to work on that as well. So, but overall, I think there's a very strong interest among students. And in the other programs I talk to, students sometimes tell me, I wish I had another course. I wish I had more emphasis on it.
In teaching future designers, are there any particular concepts or exercises you emphasize to instill kind of that circular thinking as a default versus an afterthought, as you mentioned?
Well, it depends on what level of classes I'm teaching. And I have an interesting mix because, as I mentioned, I teach this postgraduate level of people who are specifically there to study sustainable interiors. I also teach first year freshman students at a different school at Parsons in a fundamentals sustainability course. And one of the many things I talk about with them falls under the broad category of consumption. And the approach I'm taking there these days is viewing consumption as the root of many, if not most, of our environmental issues, because it's all about the things we make. Again, whether it's a building or a blouse. And I have them look at their individual consumption. And right now they're doing a 3 week long consumption diary. But then I also talk to them about whether the problem is with individual consumption or more systemically with how our growth based economies work. And that's where their eyes begin to glaze over a little bit because I'm getting into political and economic theory and they're wondering, what does this have to do with design? But we have a system in this country and a bunch of other countries that's based on continuous growth. And that is not compatible with circularity because we can't just keep making more and more stuff. So I have them think about why we buy what we buy and why we live how we live, and what parts of that are really good for us. What parts of that make us better people. Yeah, I have them, for instance, look at, I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Hmm.
And, at the bottom is what you need to survive. And then in the middle of that pyramid is I call that more or less what you need to sustain survival. And then at the top of it is what helps us flourish as individuals and as a society. And where do the things we buy, where do they fall in that pyramid? Some of them are completely outside the pyramid. They have nothing to do with survival or sustainability. They're just things that are unnecessary. And there's a place for lightweight, unnecessary consumption at times. Phrases that are being used for this now are sufficiency and frugal abundance. And I still have a problem with those because they do still connote sacrifice, I think. Sufficiency says you can only have this because you need it. And first of all, that'll never fly. It just will, though too many people will object to it. And it's not enticing. And that's how we need to be approaching our consumption. Again, it's what's of true value to us. And it doesn't have to be only for survival. It can be for bettering your mind or something, or bettering your health. But there's so much that we make that is just completely unnecessary and not helpful. As I said, little gifts and fun things have a place. And we shouldn't have to constrain ourselves to just the bare minimums. That's what I don't like about the word sufficiency. But we have to alter the way we think of consumption. And it's a much, much bigger topic because it also has to do with government policies and corporate structures and advertising and a whole realm of stuff that goes beyond what interior designers can control. But if we think of it in terms of what interior designers can control, though, one of the things that many speakers on this are talking about in circularity is that we interior designers have a fairly enormous power because we may not consume it for ourselves, but we specify a lot of consumption. So the power we have as a designer is much more than the power of an individual just buying their own things. It's, 100 or 200 times or something like that, the amount of stuff. And so we can start making demands of manufacturers that if you don't, give us an environmental product declaration and other things, that we're simply not going to buy what you're making. And we can affect the market that way. I tell my students, we have a secret strength. And that's one of the ways that we do.
Yes, yeah. And to even influence the consumer side
Mhm.
because designers so often set the trends.
Yep. And set the trends, but also at Parsons, my students, many of them are going into the arts, not into design. And I show them what artists are doing that subtly or not gets people to think differently about their consumption or their lives. I just took a group of students today to a museum exhibit of a photographer named Edward Bertinsky, who does wonderful environmental photographs and just show the scale of things to impress upon that and talk with them about how what he communicates with his photography and we study what other artists and designers communicate with their work. So we can both communicate and create. The interior design world is obviously more about creating than communicating, but we can do some of that too.
On that note, how can designers kind of find that right balance between the consumption versus, designing for what their clients want aesthetically,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
balancing circularity and
and also not talking ourselves out of a job,
right,
because
right.
I'm sure there people quote it a lot. It's Carl Elefante first said it. The greenest building is the one that's already here or already existing, and that implies we don't do anything. But we usually do have to do something, and it's a matter of seeing how much of what's there already can do what is needed, and that, by the way, can often save your client money, um, or perhaps helping your client rethink their program too. We don't have to just take a client's program and tick off the boxes in it. We can say, hey, well, what if you did it this way instead? In fact, that's what they're hiring us for when you come down to it, to help them think it through and implement it. But and then, by the way, there's also the sneaky method of just doing it environmentally and presuming there's not a huge cost difference, not even telling the client. Most of us just automatically use no added VOC paints, and then maybe $1 or $2 more a gallon. I'm not going to bother telling the client. That's just something ethically we need to be doing. Although now we have to rethink paints because of microplastics. That's another topic.
I often think of the designer Simona Fisher. One thing she said was, that it's up to the designer to perhaps present these reuse materials in a new light to make them palatable to the client.
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the things I had in my slide of the new interior designer mindset was two parts. It was getting us out of the stigma of used materials, and what I said there, and I continue to say, is that the exciting part of that, I think, is it can lead us to new paths in style and aesthetics. And part of that is looking at these second life materials as having, maybe it's a patina, an aging of some sort, having a history that can, it can become part of the story of your design. And we can be looking at these materials the same way we look at vintage clothes, that they represent something and maybe even some interesting part of history. Where was this material or this product before? I have an Eames aluminum group chair that was a sidewalk find, and one of the things I love about it, it's very old, it's not in great shape, but I've had it for decades. But one of the things I love about it, on the bottom of it, there's a tag that says property of Otis Elevator. So there's a hit somewhere in Long Island City. I think there was an Otis Elevator office building, and they must have just gotten rid of some chairs, and it ended up in my dining room.
Wow, I love things like that. And Otis Elevator of all things, it's
Yeah,
like two kind of historical
right,
brands
right. Eames and
together.
Otis.
You kind of addressed this, but in your experience, what are some of the misconceptions that designers and perhaps clients have about reuse in interiors?
Well, first of all, that something that Second Life is going to not be as good quality. It's been through things, but there are a lot of older products and materials that were better made in the first place, and they like my Eames chair, I could get that fixed up if I really wanted to. So the quality versus the stigma, as I keep mentioning, is an issue. Cost is an issue, and we're still at a point where, well, not so much with interior design, but many materials that are sustainable are more expensive, a little bit, not exorbitantly, but that's changing. And with second life materials, especially, they should be priced a little differently. They've in their manufacturing costs have been amortized already, and there are costs with reclaiming the material, maybe remanufacturing and redistributing it, but cost shouldn't be a make or break barrier for clients. That's a misnomer. And this is true of energy improvements too. When you talk about passive house design, which is getting off of our circularity area, but they've found that passive houses cost either nothing extra or maybe 5 or 10%, and that you get it back within a few years in your energy savings. So there is occasionally sometimes a first cost barrier when we're talking about energy, but it's more often than not a short return on investment ROI. But coming back to interiors materials, we're not as involved in the energy efficiency area, except for lighting and appliances. It's getting clients to understand that shiny and new isn't necessarily best.
Outside of misconceptions, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers that are preventing the wider adoption of circularity?
Well, the biggest barrier is the overall supply and demand cycle, how we get materials and products out of old spaces and back into new ones. And there's a lot of people and trades involved in that. And it's full circle. It starts with designers designing for deconstruction and then having people perform deconstruction as opposed to demolition, and then finding the paths for whether it's going to be reused as is or remanufactured or recycled, and then getting back into accessibility for interior designers. How do we get them easily exposed to those materials? And there are some things happening there. The markets are beginning to be easier. There's a pretty good market right now set up, a cycle set up for remanufactured office furniture. But still, interior designers need to know that it's there. And there are people setting up reuse centers where hopefully that'll make it closer to something like a showroom that an interior designer would go to. But that's also a matter of the interior designer mindset and thinking, well, I should be looking at this as well, or maybe first.
Until your presentation at the Build Reuse, I didn't realize what a big market there was for the remanufactured office furniture. That was eye
Well,
opening.
one of the panelists I had there was in that business, so that helped. But there are several companies doing that now. And I've talked to people who are setting up websites where you can see what construction materials and products they have available and specify from that. So that's closing that loop.
That's going to be such an important piece of the puzzle moving forward. On that note, at Build Reuse, you also kind of briefly mentioned the Center for Circularity in
Right.
Interior Design. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, some. First of all, that's a working title for what we're proposing, which is a mostly online. And it's not a seller. It's not going to be a showroom. We're not going to sell anything. It's a knowledge platform, basically, to aid the interior design profession and all the ancillary trades. First of all, understanding what circularity is and how to implement it. So we will have things like case studies and speakers and webinars, possibly some courses as we get into it, and some exhibits as we get into it. But the issue is that the interior design profession is behind the ball on this. And we need to work on that. We need to be able to get through to interior designers, not just the ones who maybe got educated in it, or the ones who are for altruistic reasons looking at it. We really need to get the entire profession on board. And so that's what this center will help to do. At the moment, we're in the formation stage. We're looking for who to partner with and who to help fund us. We need more sponsors. We have got some good responses so far, but it's in development. I hope to be able to launch it in the very near future.
Well, I can't wait to see what emerges. Are there any circular design strategies that you think are underutilized, such as modularity or designing for disassembly?
Well, all of those. I mean, designing for deconstruction for disassembly, as I've said, is not on our checklist of how we put together our projects for most designers. And it needs to be. We need to think about a project as transient, as I keep talking about, or temporary, and acknowledge that somebody has to be able to take this apart or reuse it. And it will change some of our design, especially detailing of how we put things together. And modularity can certainly be a piece of that. You know, modular walls, for instance. Right now, they can look very, I don't know, unsatisfying and commercial. I know people who are working on ways to build walls that are deconstructible and look nice. And that's a major part of it. You know, we have that in offices. You know, we have demountable partitions, but that's a different kind of thing. But even looking at how the carpets come off the floor, for instance, and just how we separate pieces of things and how our furniture comes apart for reuse and recycling. So that design for deconstruction, design for disassembly is a major piece, along with that before thought of resourcing.
Do you ever see a future where specializing in circular interior design could maybe command a market premium, almost like how being a LEED, well, or
Hmm.
living
Hmm.
building certified designer does?
Oh, yeah, I think so. It depends on whether you're talking about from the employment point of view or from the client point of view. There was Interior Design magazine a few months ago had a study of what firms are looking for in employees. And I think the second most in demand of the sort of sub professions within interior design was sustainability consultant.
Yeah.
So, and that's not specifically circularity, but that I use them almost interchangeably, which isn't technically accurate. So there's a very strong demand for designers who know how to do this. With clients, it's a different thing. And we need to get better at convincing clients of why they should do this and why they should want it. And with commercial clients, a strong piece of this is just the business bottom line. And this has been known for years that employees are more productive and get sick less, there's less absenteeism and less turnover. Onboarding employees is a major cost for a company. And if they don't have to do that, if employees can be healthier and happier and more productive, that's a win. And we can make the same kind of appeal in a sense for residential. You want your family to be healthy. So that's the healthy side of the materials. And I sort of hesitate to say this part of it for a reason I'll tell you in a sec. If you have children, you should be thinking in terms of what you're handing down, not in terms of the house, but in terms of a world. And the reason I smiled a little bit thinking of that is I sometimes tell a story about a client of mine from, well, it was actually 20 years ago now. And they didn't come to me for sustainability, which was fine. They liked my design. I loved that. And it was a couple, no children. And I said to them, if I can, give you what you're looking for in the style that you like and within the budget, are you okay with my choosing sustainable materials? And she jokingly said, well, we don't have any children. We don't care about the future. And she was joking mostly, but it was interesting. But we do have to, employ that seventh generation thinking, which is a cultural change. And interestingly, by the way, I love this. This is the second half of this story. They came back to me like 15 years later to do a new renovation of a different space for them. And that same person said, "Oh, I've been researching all these sustainable materials and cool stuff." And I thought, great, I've got a convert here.
That must have been very rewarding. What would a fully circular interior design industry look like?
In the end, not much different, I think, than what we have now. It's just a matter of that mindset and finding the mechanism to implement that mindset. So it's again, mechanism and mindset. And it may be some different materials, but that doesn't mean they're lesser. There are plenty of beautiful materials that, for instance, aren't fossil fuel based. And certainly some elements of construction and demolition deconstruction will change. We need to educate interior designers, but also the rest of the cycle. And there'll be a little bit of a change in how we source our materials. But I think it's going to become natural. Once everything is a little better established, which I see happening pretty quickly, I don't think our practice is going to change, with the exception of understanding that we have a responsibility past handing the project over to the client. I think that is a major mindset.
I like that idea too. It's giving them kind of a playbook for the
Yeah.
future.
And I also don't want to have anybody have the impression that we have to completely relearn things. This is not going to be a earth-shattering upheaval of the profession. It's just the next level.
I like that. Makes it more approachable too.
Exactly.
If you could issue one challenge to the design community regarding
Ooh,
reuse and circularity, what would it be?
I think there's so many. One is envision who it is that's going to be changing your place, your project in the next life of of the project. How are they going to deal with what you're designing? That's that extended responsibility aspect of it. And the other is just to embed in your mindset that old can be good.
To close out, consider this quote from Maya Angelou: "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better." If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend or colleague, or leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast player, but only if you liked it. Let's keep spreading the word about healthy and regenerative design. Lastly, if you have an idea for the show or want more content about this topic, visit piperrepublic.com. Thanks for listening.